Hi there, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Zachary Schrag, the author of The Fires of Philadelphia, Citizen Soldiers, Nativists, and the 1844 Riots Over the Soul of the Nation. This is his fourth book. He's a professor of history at George Mason University. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Schrag.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We are going to donate part of your contributions, a big part of them, to a charity for children's literacy. Philadelphia, the place where the members of the Continental Congress signed their names to a document that said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." As we know, that message in the practice of the time was only meant for men and only for certain men. But those words do set the tone for our highest ideals. 70 years later, after the Declaration, in 1844 in Philadelphia, there was violence, there was racism, there was a clash of ideas over what America should be. Nativists, who called themselves Native American, interestingly enough, wanted to rid Philly of the others. The others, who were Irish and Catholic, didn't want to go anywhere. So first of all, Dr. Schrag, what did it mean to be American in the 1840s in Philadelphia?
So this is exactly what people were debating and ultimately fighting about, because I would say there were, just to simplify things, a couple main views. There were those who believed that to be American meant to be descended from the English Protestant families that had largely governed the East Coast going back to the 17th century, and who had fought the Revolutionary War and served in the government. And then there were a number of challenges to that by the 1830s and 1840s. Obviously, the most famous divisions are racial. So you have debates over whether the true Native Americans, American Indians, could be citizens. And we see this with the Cherokee attempts to gain power and land. And ultimately that, fails. And President Jackson expels the Cherokee out of their ancestral lands and other Indians as well. We see this, of course, with slavery and the debates over whether slaves would be freed and whether freed African Americans would be able to participate as full citizens. And in many cases, the answer is no, and they are both losing rights. They lose the right to vote in Pennsylvania, for example, and they lose the right to live in some cases where they're attacked by mobs. There are other groups as well. You've got the Mormons, who are, trying to find a place in the new country in the 1830s and 1840s, and also subject to mob violence. And then you have the immigrants, and there are a number of immigrant groups coming in. The largest, most prominent of whom are the Irish Catholics. There had been Irish immigration to North America for decades, but really after the War of 1812, it's much more Catholic immigration rather than Protestant Irish coming over. And it's their presence that starts the riots in Philadelphia that are the subject of my book.
How many of those groups are saying, we're American, we're the real Americans?
I think they all are in one way or another. With you have, again, with the African Americans, you have David Walker citing the Declaration of Independence and saying, look, I was born in this country. Certainly Joseph Smith and the Mormons are claiming Americanness, as are the Cherokee and others. And with the Irish, they are certainly proud of their Irish heritage, but also see themselves as loyal Americans. They have July 4th parades, they join political parties, they serve in the militia, they look back at the Irish participants in the American Revolution. An Irish Protestant, Richard Montgomery, was a general in the Revolution, and he's a source of pride for a lot of Irish immigrants, both Catholic and Protestant. So they are definitely staking a claim to say that America should be a place where you belong based on your willingness to become a good citizen and not because of your ancestry.
Your book opens with a striking scene. Louis Levin, you're going to have to introduce us to who that is. But Louis Levin, you this is what you wrote. he looks out over the crowd and doesn't see Americans. Yes, some of the Irishmen had been here for 5 years. Some had gotten papers, but nothing could make those who loved kings and popes truly American, no matter what they did. Americans who were born here had an instinctual love of liberty. Who is Louis Levin, and where did he get these ideas?
So Levin is a fascinating figure, not a very nice person, but a sort of anti-hero to the book. Interestingly enough, he himself is the son of immigrants. His parents are Jews who come over from England, and he is born, not terribly long after they arrive, but he is born in the United States. He's born in South Carolina, and he invents himself and reinvents himself several times. I mean, he's very much a sort of Jay Gatsby figure in that. He tries on different careers. He's a merchant, he's a school teacher, he's a lawyer. He moves in many different states. It's not entirely possible to track all of his movements, and there are some stories about him that seem implausible, but you never know. He probably fights in a duel. He certainly gets in some knife fights. He's an angry young Southerner. And, I think I have this hypothetical that if he had stayed in the South, he could have been a kind of major sort of slavery defender along the lines of Judah Benjamin, who eventually serves in the Confederate cabinet. Instead, he ends up in Pennsylvania. And, the other thing about him, he gets drunk a lot and gambles. And then he finds some kind of conversion, and can't nail it down, but it's pretty clear that he is converted to Protestantism, gives up drinking, and becomes a spokesperson initially for temperance, credits the sobriety for turning around his life. But then he turns against the Irish, first as Irish, then as Catholics. And it's not always easy to follow his thinking, as it's generally hard with someone who's really committed to the hate. But he comes to believe that the Irish are a menace, that the Pope is planning to take over the country, and that the only way to stop this is to extend the naturalization period from 5 years to 21 years. So that an Irish immigrant would have to live in the United States for 21 years, and even then they'd be somewhat suspect. There are some positions, including in the army, that Levin thinks should only go to native-born Americans. So he's drawing on some very old ideas of anti-Catholicism that go back to the English Reformation. He's also mixing in some new ideas as well in terms of citizenship. But his basic belief system is that whatever the Irish say about their fidelity to American values, they are fundamentally foreign and fundamentally monarchist as well, that they were born in this kingdom, the United Kingdom, and on top of that, they have sworn allegiance to the Pope, who's an elected monarch, so they are loyal to two monarchs and cannot be good citizens of the American Republic.
And certainly, just sitting here listening to you describe this, certainly it starts to sound a lot like the discussion over John Kennedy in the 1960s. And it sounds a lot like what we saw in the 1870s and 80s with the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And it sounds a lot like the argument over, and I'm using big air quotes here, Sharia law coming to the United States and taking over, doesn't it?
Yes, nativism is a pretty enduring and in some ways static belief system. The names and the ideas swap out, but certainly, when you bring up Sharia law, the idea that these people who have a different religion also have a different legal code, that's very much the same rhetoric that's used against Catholics in the 19th century, that they cannot swear oaths, and, because their true allegiance is to the Pope, they're trying to impose papal rule rather than the Sharia rule, so that part's very familiar. The other part that's always familiar is the economic competition, whether you're talking about Chinese in the late 19th century, whether you're talking about Latino migrants today, or Irish in the 1840s, the common refrain is those people are going to work for low wages and drag down the living standards for native-born workers. So that part's very familiar. The one part that is a little new in later decades is the racialization. Your listeners are probably familiar with some of the very ugly cartoons drawn of Irish Americans by Thomas Nast and others, showing them as kind of ape-like figures. That tends not to show up until after the famine, so the 1850s. For the most part, there are a couple exceptions, but for the most part, the Irish immigrants of the 1840s were not perceived as racially different, just religiously and ethnically and politically different.
We have to talk about the press also, because in all those different scenarios that I just mentioned, the press plays a role in cultivating nativism. What role is the press playing in the 1840s? And one thing that I say over and over again on the show is it's important to remember that at the time, this was no golden age of media, no golden age of the press. The press was partisan, and the press had a goal, and they wanted to make you believe something. They got up every day and printed papers specifically to espouse one particular viewpoint. What were they doing in the 1840s in Philadelphia to cultivate nativism?
Right. So the newspapers of the 1840s are still a somewhat new invention. The penny press sort of shows up in the 1830s, where the idea is that it's going to be accessible to a lot of people. Very cheap. You've got the newsboys out there shouting extra, extra, or whatever, some close equivalent to that. But that notion that you'd be flooding the streets with newspapers, and a lot of competing newspapers. There were something like 18 newspapers in Philadelphia in the 1840s. Not all of them survive. And people would write about this, like, did I even subscribe to this, right? There's this newspaper on my breakfast table. Where did it come from? Because people were founding newspapers in 1844 alone. So Levin is a newspaper editor. He has The Sun, which has sort of the nativist newspaper line at the start of 1844. By the end of 1844, there are two more nativist dailies and a nativist weekly, edited by a woman, actually. And so they're just being flooded. And so they're competing for eyeballs, as we would say now. They're trying to get attention. And the way you do that is outrage. So there's this constant stream of, have you heard of the latest outrage? And there will be some little comment that some priest makes or some bishop makes, and they will just run with it for days and weeks at a time, because there's really not that much news, and try to build up outrage that way. And then they're also building a political movement. So political parties were still pretty new in the 1840s. You have the Democratic Party kind of shows up in the late 1820s, the Whig Party in the 1830s. And so people weren't really sure what a political party was, how many there should be, what they should be called. Pennsylvania has the Anti-Masonic Party, and you have these, various efforts, the Liberty Party in New York, special interest parties. And starting in 1835 in New York and then spreading, there's this idea of maybe we should have a party for nativists. And Levin himself, his newspaper is officially neutral, though it's very supportive of this movement. Other newspapers are very explicitly Native American is the name of the party, or American Republican. Those names are kind of interchangeable. They're going to endorse these candidates and build a third party movement. And people aren't taking it too seriously until April 1844, when a nativist wins as mayor of New York City. And suddenly, people think, wow, that's a kind of major office. This party could really have legs. And I think that event is extremely important to the riots in Philadelphia, that seeing the possibility of a successful nativist movement as a political party, the nativists in Philadelphia really push up their efforts, and they have rallies all over Philadelphia County, including one in the 3rd Ward of Kensington, which is where the violence starts.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I've been to Philadelphia many times. I have cousins who live there. I've been to the Phillies games. I've been to a Flyers game. I've been to all the different tourist sites. What was Philly? And it's a wonderful, beautiful, historic city with very complex and very interesting neighborhoods and cheesesteaks and their own cultural touchstones and their own accent. What was Philadelphia like at this point in the 1840s? What was it like to live there?
Philadelphia, was founded by William Penn at the end of the 17th century, and he had this idea that it should be 2 square miles going from the Delaware on the east to the Schuylkill on the west. And that kind of works, but in fact, the Delaware River is a lot more navigable than the Schuylkill. So really, Philadelphia grows north-south and bursts boundaries. It goes the urbanization grows north of the northern border, south of the southern border, into what was then Philadelphia County. And as this spreads, it actually becomes kind of a collection of cities. Several of the largest cities in the United States are all in Philadelphia County, including Kensington, including Southwark, and some others. And some of these are pretty rough. I think if Gritty were to skate by, he'd be perfectly welcome. You had youth gangs. You had a fair amount of street crime. You had these volunteer fire companies that would show up at fires, and instead of fighting fire, they would just beat the crap out of each other to try to get to the fire plugs while the buildings burned around them. And you had very limited government. You had basically no professional police outside of the center city of Philadelphia. And the other thing I should mention here is it was very rapid growth. It slowed down some in 1837 when you have the Panic of 1837, but a lot of buildings were going up. And what that means is that there were bricks and loose stones everywhere. This is one of the things, actually, I live in Arlington County, and, there are buildings going up. And I always sort of have begun to notice, like, wow, there are a lot of bricks around. If you wanted to riot, you could just, the ammunition is right there. There are really a lot of—
Don't give any ideas. Don't give any ideas.
So it's a pretty rough neighborhood, both physically, in terms of government. And so it's not that hard to start a significant fight over a fairly trivial incident.
For those who don't know, Gritty is the worst mascot in professional sports. I'm a Ranger fan. I've got my Ranger stuff behind that Dr. Schrag can see on the wall behind me. How did the city's connection to the earliest days of America, how did the fact that it is the center of the Declaration of Independence and the center of the Continental Congress and the center of the American kind of experiment, how did that influence its future as a fight over who is an American?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of the participants were keenly aware of that heritage. The founding generation has basically passed by this point. James Madison dies famously in 1836, right? So 60 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so, suddenly this new country is on its own, but everyone wants to claim the revolutionary legacy. And so you see this in the different groups where George Washington in particular becomes a touchstone. Washington himself was religiously tolerant. He writes the famous letter to the Jews of Newport. He writes
my favorite letter in American history.
To the Catholics of Philadelphia. And they have that letter, I think, stored in St. Augustine's Church. The Catholics are claiming George Washington as a figure who understood that America would welcome different faiths, and they're claiming his legacy, whereas the Nativists basically misquote him. He says in his farewell address, beware of foreign influences. And he's almost certainly talking about foreign alliances, but they take that line and use it as a slogan suggesting that he was anti-immigrant, which I don't think he was. But they're also pointing to the line in the Constitution saying that only a native-born citizen can become president. And they say, well, that shows that the revolutionary generation was suspicious of foreigners. There's a line that they claim that at some point during the Revolutionary War, Washington only wanted native-born soldiers standing watch. So both sides are claiming the legacy. And, eventually the Nativists do rally in the State House Square, which is what they called Independence Square at that point. and claim again to sort of be true to the legacy of 76. So it, unfortunately, the rhetoric can go both ways, and both sides are able to persuade themselves that they are the true upholders of the American tradition.
So let's get into how these clashes start and how they form. This is all over a very modern issue. This is all over, well, not all, nothing is all, but school prayer is at the center of all this. There's a bishop named Bishop Kenrick. He objects to the teaching of Protestant hymns. There's a suggestion that Bible readings be suspended until the school board can come up with a solution. So what did the Nativists want in a literal sense, and how did school prayer start the kindle that, is that the right way to say it? Start the fire that led to Nativist riots?
So this is an issue that actually goes back across the Atlantic, where the British Empire is trying to figure out how to incorporate all these Irish Catholics into their system. And one of the real sticking points is, what do you do with public schools? Because in the 19th century, people begin to realize, wow, there are going to be a lot of what we now call white collar jobs. We need a lot of clerks. We need a lot of shop girls. We need people to be literate. We need basic reading and writing and arithmetic, as well as morality. So the notion of school as kind of common or even universal experience is new in the 19th century, the notion of a public school. And the problem for 19th century figures is that pretty much everyone, Protestant and Catholic, believe that the Bible is the essence of morality, and schools should teach morality. And so you need some kind of Bible in the school, but they can't agree on what a Bible is. The Protestants think that a Bible is the King James translation without note or comment. The Catholics say, no, we've got a better translation, the Douay translation. And not only does that have the superior translation and additional books of the Bible the Protestants don't consider canon, it also has this commentary from centuries of bishops to help you understand what it means. And neither side can really recognize the other's Bible as a Bible. So they can agree that there should be Bibles, but they can't agree what a Bible should be. And in big parts of the British Empire, including Canada, they kind of worked this out by having separate Protestant and Catholic schools. Americans, with their traditions of separation of church and state, don't want to do that. And so it becomes a major issue both in New York and in Philadelphia. I don't think it's the only issue going on. Sometimes these riots are called Bible riots. I think that term dates only to the 1960s. I can't find anyone in the 19th century calling them Bible riots. So that's why I bring in other factors like the New York City mayoral election. But it certainly was an issue around which the Protestants could, again, gain the outrage that sold newspapers. And they would make up stories about Catholic aldermen throwing Bibles out the window, which almost certainly didn't happen. The Catholics would turn around and have their own outrage about little children being whipped for not reading the Bible. And so it was a real problem, but also one that I think symbolized a broader question of, again, American identity. Is American identity fundamentally Protestant, or is it fundamentally secular? And so in that sense, it was a non-trivial issue that I think we still have yet to work out.
We're overlooking the first part of the title of your book, which is the citizen soldiers and the militias. And the book focuses on the clash. We've talked a lot about nativists, but it's between the nativists and these militias and the citizen soldiers. So who are the citizen soldiers that lead off the subtitle of your book? How are they formed? And they have this interesting bend towards, as I read your book, towards what passed for equality in the 1840s. This is something that they're very cognizant of guarding. Explain who they are.
Yeah, so this is actually what I first got interested in, was if you think about the George Floyd riots of 2020, in I think over 30 states, the National Guard were called out to, do civil order operations of various kinds. And I believe just, obviously this came again in January 2021 with the National Guard deployment to Washington. Who are the National Guard and what are they doing in the streets? And to answer that question, you do have to go back, especially to the Jacksonian period. listeners probably know, the militia shows up in the Constitution. It's in the Second Amendment. It's in the Constitution itself. But it's not very well defined. We have these centuries-long fights over gun control because of the ambiguities of the Second Amendment. But we also have ambiguities about who's going to be in the militia, and especially what its duties at home will be in times of disorder. Theoretically, again, going back to sort of 17th century Whig ideas, the militia is sort of all men, all white men in the US context of military age are supposed to show up. No one wants to do that. Get pulled out of work or leisure once or more times a year. So by the 1820s, most Americans are very reluctant to do militia duty. They'll show up with broomsticks or some kind of mock weapon and make fun of their officers. But you've got the separate component, the volunteer militia, the uniformed militia. They go by various names, often just called the volunteers, who are essentially like National Guardsmen today. They take their roles very seriously. They're very proud that they are not professional soldiers. They think that someone who takes money to be a soldier could potentially be in it for the money and serve a tyrant, whereas the citizen soldier is doing it out of pure patriotism. And they will train and they will drill and they will do target practice and they have good uniforms. But all of this, they think they are doing to repel foreign invasion. And we see this in 1812, the War of 1812, where, the British do show up and the militia turn out and they, help defend, obviously, the Battle of Bladensburg, not the militia's finest hour, but they do what they can to keep out the British. And that's what the volunteers of the 1830s and 40s essentially sign up to do, is to fight back the British or the French or some other European army that might show up. Increasingly, however, they are called not to fight the British or the French, but fellow Americans, as riots just burst out starting around 1831. And a lot of these have to do with questions of slavery and abolition. You have all kinds of attacks, again, on African-American communities. But you also have work riots, strikes. You have other religious riots. You have various kinds of civil protests. And it's a real problem because the militia, again, they didn't sign up for this. And they also have this theory that they represent the people, but the people are out there in the street. And so they have to decide, are we going to shoot our neighbors? And they are very reluctant to do so, but pushed far enough, they will.
So how does the first clash start? You say in May, it's the first, May of 1844 is the first city riot in the United States. And what can we learn from this riot about how violence is birthed by rhetoric?
I think I call it the first great city riot in the United States. There are certainly riots before then, again, especially starting in the 1830s. What's surprising and shocking to a lot of people in May of 1844 is that the riots last for 3 days. And that brings it to a new scale because, it's one thing to have a brawl among firemen or, some kind of, again, spontaneous or seemingly spontaneous fight, but usually people sleep it off and by the next morning, they're ready to sweep up the glass and put away the bricks. And what happens in May is that the nativists, the first day of rioting, May 6th of 1844, that's not terribly unusual in that the nativists are holding this rally. The Irish come to heckle. There's a freak occurrence, again, the contingency of history, which is a big rainstorm, and that throws off everyone's plans. The nativists run into the nearest shelter, which is a market house full of Irish Catholics, and that was not what they or the Irish Catholics were planning. And they start a fight, and all of that, again, is kind of within bounds. What changes things a bit is someone pulls out some pistols and shoots. And this is a
couple of people die, yeah.
Yeah, so the gunfire is unusual. And again, we see this kind of also even in 2020, 2021, right? At the Capitol riot, that was really bad. People were killed, but I believe there was one round fired in the whole case where the Capitol Police, shot the woman who was bursting through the door. And there's a big taboo against firearms even today, even among very heavily armed police, and probably there were a lot of guns in that crowd. Certainly there were a lot of guns in Philadelphia in the 1840s. Henry Derringer was out there making guns. He wasn't making little pocket pistols yet, but there he was. You could buy powder and shot, at your corner store to go hunting for birds. But people were, for the most part, reluctant to use them. And there is gunfire on that first day, and several people are hit. And so that's a surprise. And then what's really, shocking to people is the nativists hold this massive rally the next day in the shadow of Independence Hall. And a lot of people are saying, hey, we really need to take a break. Let's, meet back here on Thursday. Let's let things calm down. And the hotheads win. And they say, let's march right back to Kensington. And that starts a second round of violence, including a lot of arson. And then on the third day, 2 Catholic churches are burned, gutted in flame. And so this is a scale of rioting that America had not known really since the Revolution, if then. Europe had its riots. You have the Gordon riots in 1780, but Americans were appalled by this. And throughout all of this, the militia does not fire a shot. They show up, they march, they do intimidate people to stop firing, but they are grossly outnumbered, and they can't protect the churches especially. There are just too many people, and it just takes a couple of boys with matches to start a church on fire. So they are unable to save the churches. Eventually they deploy around other churches and say, you've got 5 minutes to get off the street or we're going to open up cannon fire. That persuades people to go home. But the militia does not kill anyone in May 1844, because again, that would just be another huge line that they are not ready to cross.
What happens between, there's really 2 big sets of riots, things simmer between them, but what happens between the May riots and the July riots, and why did the July riots then ramp up again?
So everyone after the May riots, can you hear that?
Oh yeah, I hear you. Okay. Perfect.
Sorry, I got a little glitch there. Everyone after the May riots is worried that things are going to start right back up. There's a lot of tension. People are collecting weapons and wondering what will happen next. Seems like things are calming down, but the nativists, again, to claim the legacy of the revolution, decide that the best thing they should do is to hold the biggest parade in Philadelphia's history, bigger even than the George Washington Centennial of 1832. They're going to do this on July 4th. And they're going to march through the streets of Philadelphia. They're going to march right back into the Irish neighborhoods. And they're going to have these banners, again, a lot of them with pictures of George Washington saying, beware of foreign influence. They're going to take some of the men, the Protestants who were wounded in the riots, and have them ride in the carriages and show off their wounds. And they're going to have banners, some of which are quite offensive to Catholics, showing the dangers of the papacy. And the Catholics, understand this as a threat. And so a couple of brothers in particular in the neighborhood of Southwark decide that they need to protect their church. So you've got a priest, John Paul Dunn, his brother William Dunn, and they start stockpiling weapons, some of them actually from the state of Pennsylvania. They say that under the law, they are entitled to get surplus weapons and protect their church. Others, they just buy or improvise. And when the Protestants nearby find out about this on the next day, July 5th, they think, the Catholics are planning to murder us in our sleep. So what the Catholics understand as defensive weapons, the nativists understand as offensive weapons. This is like a little Cuban Missile Crisis in miniature. And like the Cuban Missile Crisis, it just gets worse and worse. So you have mobs surrounding the church. They call in the sheriff to take out the weapons, even though they're legally there. And eventually, George Cadwallader, who's a major figure in the book, is the brigadier general in charge of Philadelphia. He marches his brigade down to try to keep order and takes prisoners and puts militia in the church, including, probably unwisely, a company of Irish Catholic immigrants, the Montgomery Hibernia Greens, which only confirms every Protestant suspicion. You've got Irish Catholic soldiers in a Catholic church just waiting to strike out and holding Protestant prisoners. Eventually the Protestants, nativists in the neighborhood, steal some cannon. It was remarkably easy to get a cannon in 1844. There were ships in the Delaware that still had them. They roll it down and they start bombarding the church. Chase the militia out. The militia do fire at this point in self-defense. They don't hit anyone, but this is, at a point where they're firing their weapons. And then eventually Cadwallader says, well, I've got to clean this out. He marches his brigade back in. take command of the whole block. And when someone throws a rock and starts, hits one of his officers, the troops do fire into the crowd. And this starts a really bloody battle that lasts all night. Both sides have cannon. You can, just imagine the night sky lighting up with these cannon flashes. They bring in the cavalry. It's just a real awful night in Philadelphia's history, and nothing like Americans had seen again, really, since the Revolutionary era, the Revolution Chases Rebellion. These are Americans killing Americans with artillery.
To make a long story short, how do these fights wrap up? How does Philadelphia then reorganize? How does the city get a handle on all of this? In other words, what is the short-term impact of these fights, and how does a lid get put back on?
So the book does not have a terribly happy ending. The ending I would have liked would have been for, the good people of Philadelphia to say, oh, these nativists are just horrible people. Let's, shun them and vote them down. Instead, there are elections in October of 1844. Elections was more of a season than a day in the 1840s. And a lot of the nativists win. And some of them win local office. They fairly narrowly lose the mayor's job of Philadelphia. They actually come in second. And they win 3 seats in Congress, including Lewis Levin, who's, again, this terrible person, gets elected to the United States Congress on the nativist ticket. And he does so in part with support, not from the, super rabid nativists, but also from a lot of sort of moderate Whigs who decide that for all of their violence, the nativists are still less of a threat than the Irish Catholics and the Democratic Party that is supporting them. So in that way, it's sort of appalling. On the other hand, the violence does stop, in part, I think, because the nativists got what they wanted, which again is not a super happy ending. But if you can win at the election, then you don't need the violence. And I think the violence helped them win. They have these martyrs. They can show that the Irish Catholics are a menace. They spin the story in a way to win. And then over the next 10 years, Philadelphia has to rethink what it's going to do to prevent this kind of violence, because they've had other riots as well, the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, again, a lot of violence against African Americans and abolitionists. And they end up taking over the entire county. So in 1854, what had been this 2 square mile city of Philadelphia merges with the vastly larger Philadelphia County. And you get Philadelphia in its present borders, a much larger community. And one of the things you can do with this much larger city is build a professional police force, which Philadelphia had, barely had prior to this. London had one in the 1820s. New York starts one in the 1840s, and Philadelphia starts another one in the 1850s. So in many ways, the police departments we have today are outgrowths of these and other riots.
There is a bit of I don't want to use the word victory, but there are some things we can take away that would seem to be generally productive for the rest of society. You say in the book, beautiful passage, you say, the ruined walls of St. Augustine are monuments to religious intolerance. What statement did building the new churches make in light of all this violence that they went through? And many of the churches, as you say, were damaged. And it's a good thing they had them when even more Irish people started showing up too.
Right. So, there were some thoughts that this was not the country for the Irish. Some Irish families leave Philadelphia. Some leave the United States and actually return to Ireland. Not a good choice in the 1840s. One of the great ironies here is that, you've got these nativists trying to slow down Irish immigration in 1844, which was the last year the potatoes were any good. So in the fall of 1844, even as the Philadelphians are cleaning up from this, they're getting these newspaper reports. Oh, there's this weird thing that's happening with potatoes up in New England. And you see this like, oh, you folks have no idea what's coming. So, by 1845, the blight has arrived in Ireland. It gets, the worst of it is 1847, Black 47. And the Irish just start coming in numbers beyond anyone's anticipation of the earlier 1840s. And so in some sense, all of this is rendered moot. On the other hand, they have the, Irish who had been in Philadelphia had been reasonably traumatized by the riots. They start, the bishops, again, had always sort of hoped for a parochial school system. They accelerate that after the riots. It costs a lot of money to set up a separate school system. What they really wanted was a taxpayer-supported parochial school system, which they don't get. So the Catholic school system is slower to grow in Philadelphia. But they basically decide, no, we're going to stake our ground. We're going to remain. And so there is this kind of uneasy peace where the Nativist party remains powerful for several years in Philadelphia. Eventually it fades out, but it comes roaring back in the 1850s under the name of the Know Nothings, and really becomes a significant component of the Republican Party when it's formed in the 1850s and, gets into national office. So, in that sense, as you say, a lot of this is not resolved when Kennedy runs for office in 1960.
Bishop Kenrick finds that the fighting, he's doing this kind of investigation, this kind of discovery process after this is all going on. He finds that the fighting is an aberration on America's, for the lack of a better term, long run towards equality. What were the signs that he finds that this fighting is an aberration? And was he correct?
So, he goes back and forth. He has his good days and his bad days. I think the worst is in the 1850s, there's another riot in Louisville, Kentucky, very similar to the Philadelphia riots. The church does not burn, but it is attacked. There's election violence. Again, they're trying to run up the Know Nothing party. And at that point, he begins to think, well, maybe it wasn't such much of an aberration. But he generally, has faith. And I think part of what helps him out there is the fact that the militia who did turn out to defend that third church in July of 1844, while, again, one of the key companies was composed primarily of Irish Catholics, most of the militia was Protestant, and some of them were Nativist. And, that's, to me, a kind of hopeful and key moment is where officers and men who kind of sympathize with the crowd in terms of their suspicion of Catholicism and of Irish immigration, still decide that they are going to do their duty, and that they might vote Nativist, but they will also, shoot and defend themselves, not as Nativists, but as proud citizen soldiers, that they are going to, put their personal beliefs aside in the name of duty and constitutional order. And I think that gives a lot of comfort, knowing that, whatever differences or suspicions the Protestant majority has, they ultimately will uphold the law and protect a religious and ethnic minority. And I think this is again, is sort of one of the reasons I got so interested in this topic. In America, in Democracy in America, Tocqueville famously warns of the tyranny of the majority. And he specifically warns that the militia is not reliable because it may adopt majoritarian impulses, may do what the majority wants rather than protect minorities. And in 1844, fortunately, that doesn't happen. The militia does turn out to protect a minority. And I think that is a pretty key moment in American democracy.
I think one thing, at least that I've learned from reading your book, is in America, the outsiders often become the insiders pretty quickly. Maybe it takes a little longer in some groups, but there's often this kind of redrawing the diagram of what it means to be an American after we go through periods like this. Did you take that away as well?
Eventually, yes. I mean, again, it takes a very long time, particularly in terms of party affiliation. In one of the reactions to the riots is a Whig editor in New York saying, I think we've lost the Irish vote. And indeed, they lost the Irish vote for a very long time. Well into the 20th century, Irish Catholics are, seeing the Democrats as their friends. Because I should mention, the Whig Party, while not officially Nativist, is heavily Nativist. Frelinghuysen, who's the vice presidential candidate in 1844, is an outspoken Nativist. And so, in that sense, it's a very gradual process. And again, big fights in 1928 over Al Smith's nomination as the Democratic candidate for the presidency. And so it's really, you could argue that some of this distrust lasts into the 1970s. Now, of course, you've got, Irish Catholics, many of them are Republicans, some of them are on the Supreme Court. They're not permanent Democrats, but for many generations, I think the violence of the 1840s and 1850s helped polarization in the country. So, I think time heals a lot of wounds, but sometimes a big wound takes a lot of time to heal.
What I assume you did trips to Philadelphia as part of your research. What was it like? What is it like to be in Philadelphia today, particularly at the sites where the riots and fighting took place?
Yeah, so there's not too much of the landscape left. Obviously, Independence Hall is still there. Two of the churches were destroyed in 1844. They've been rebuilt to more or less the same standards, though St. Michael's, I think, is more different than St. Augustine's. Ironically, two of the other churches that were threatened but did not burn, burned later just by accident. You have a lot of fires in the 19th century. So, that, and certainly, like a lot of the sort of mansions of the major figures in the book, those have all been, developed. The newspaper office of Lewis Levin, I believe, is now the Museum of the American Revolution. So there's not too much to see. There are, definitely lovely blocks of Philadelphia that retain some of that 19th century feel. If you've ever been to Philadelphia, you may know the term small streets, with these wonderful narrow passages. And I actually had a friend who had a house on one of these small streets, and I was able to sort of stay there and think of myself as being in the 1840s with the brick and the, the marble stoops and all. But one thing you can get is the small scale of this. You can walk from, again, Independence Hall down to St. Philip's in Southwark, and it's not that far a walk. And you get a sense of these places as being, pretty close to the center of the city, but not quite in the center of the city. And, that's quite interesting to me. And then, the other thing is, surprising amount of paper has survived from the 1840s. Some of my research was on microfilm, some of it was on computers, but a bunch of those newspapers, I was there going through the bound volumes or the unbound issues in some cases and turning the pages. And it was really neat for me to be able to touch the 1840s as well as to see it.
Where is Philadelphia now in the discussion of equality and immigration and equal opportunity?
Well, interestingly, the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney, Irish Catholic descent, and he is keenly aware of this. Most Americans, I'm guessing most of your listeners, have not even heard of these riots. I had not heard of these riots when I started the project, but if you were very attuned to the 2016 Democratic Convention, which was held in Philadelphia, when Mayor Kenney gives his welcome address to the Democrats, he warns of xenophobia as a problem in America. And he specifically calls out the 1840s riots in great accuracy, I should mention. A lot of people make mistakes about them, but Mayor Kenney knows his stuff. So, I think people who are attuned to the history of immigration understand, again, that whatever critiques are coming out now are really not terribly new. One of the things you'll hear now is, oh yeah, back when my grandfather came, America needed workers, but now we're full. Well, people were saying that in the 1840s as well. They're saying, oh yeah, back, when my people came, there was this open land, but it's now all full up. We're closing the doors. We're done. So, in that sense, I think the history of immigration, as you mentioned, not just the violence against Irish immigrants, but the legal restrictions against Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants and the immigration restrictions in the 1920s. All of this help us understand that a lot of these fears are overblown. On the other hand, I would point out that in some sense, the bigots were right, that there are a lot of Irish Catholics in America, and one of them is president of the United States, right? They're on the Supreme Court. They're in positions of power. In that sense, the people who are warning that if you let these Irish immigrants in now, it will change the country forever, that's true. same thing with like the annexation of Hawaii. If you annex Hawaii, eventually they'll become a state, and then they'll send, senators of Asian descent to the Senate. Well, yeah, that's exactly what happened. So to some extent, we can't be completely dismissive of the nativist warnings. It's just a question of whether you think, again, the taco truck on every corner is a sign of civilizational collapse or the best possible thing ever.
How do we avoid this? How do we avoid nativist fighting? How do we avoid hate and anger? Like it or not, you are now an expert in nativism. Do you want to risk drawing the parallels of the 1840s to the native movements that we see today? And again, the key question is, what do we do to stop the anger and vitriol towards one another?
Yeah, I don't think, as a historian, I hate to prescribe, and I particularly hate to prescribe the solution of the 1840s, which was canister shot. I really would not like to see today's vitriol continue in violence. I mean, I do think the January 6th attack on the Capitol was in part a nativist riot. And, of course, it left people dead, and it left our democracy scarred. And so, I hate to see that be the resolution. Unfortunately, again, a lot of the alternatives that are coming out in the 19th century don't look that good either. You could say, well, you could elect nativists into office. Well, that didn't work terribly well. You could say, have a big famine in other parts of the world so that the issue becomes moot. I'm certainly not presenting that as a particularly good option, though I think we can think about the Great Famine in Ireland as a precursor of some of the climate issues that we're going to be facing in the next century, as we're going to probably have more famines and more mass migration as a result, as we did in the 1840s. No, I do not have any easy solutions. I do hope that people who are inclined to nativism will take a look at their own family histories and the history of their country and realize that this country was, in fact, built on immigration and a melding of cultures and a secular constitution. And there's a tradition there that can turn people from all over the world into Americans and turn America into a richer and better place as a result.
Dr. Zachary Schrag, the author of The Fires of Philadelphia, Citizen Soldiers, Nativists, and the 1844 Riots Over the Soul of a Nation. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for the great questions.
Certainly check out that book and his website, which is ZacharySchrag.com. He's on Twitter at Zachary Schrag. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.